Hi, and welcome to the Boss Audits and Investigations. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Scientology Chronicles. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for the interest in this series where we go through various government agencies' declassified documents and investigative interviews obtained through FOIA requests. For those that may be interested, seasons 1 and 2 of the Scientology Chronicles is now available as an audio podcast on several podcast platforms such as Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and many others. I want to also thank all of the new listeners that have found this content through whatever audio podcast platform you use. If you're interested in seeing the actual documents discussed in the audio version, all the episodes can be found on my YouTube channel at the Boss Audits and Investigations. No matter what platform you listen to the content on, please take a moment and give it a like, a subscribe, a share, follow, or even leave a review. And as always, please leave me a comment with your feedback about the episode. Some of these episodes do require a trigger warning, so please make sure to take good care of yourself. And if you need a break, some of these topics are very sensitive in nature and self care. So please take care of yourselves. Okay, let's jump right in. This document, it's a little hard to read. It's very faint. It's kind of faint. It's not one of the better and easier documents to read. So we're going to jump right in. This is an account from January 31st of 1968, and it was an interview that they did with a Victorine Mertz, and it's regarding her husband Thomas Mertz. On January 29th, 1968, I received a call from Mrs. Victorine Mertz. She called to inquire of proceedings against the founding Church of Scientology. I informed Mrs. Mertz of the seizure action involving the e-meters, the contested seizure, and the appeal. I advised Mrs. Mertz that the appeal is pending. Mrs. Mertz informed me that her husband, Thomas, has been associated with Scientology for 17 years, since 1951, after reading Dianetics. During this conversation and subsequent interview on January 30th of 1968, the following information was obtained. Thomas Mertz is 44 years old. He was graduated from the University of Delaware in 1944. He received a master's degree from the University of Delaware in 1947. He reportedly holds a responsible position with Sun Oil Corporation from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He first became associated with Scientology after reading Dianetics in 1951. He later began attending Scientology meetings in Philadelphia. A small group was formed in Wilmington, Delaware, roughly in 1955. The group supposedly consisted of a Dr. Robert Guilford, Chris Rossi, and Thomas Mertz. At that time, Robert Guilford was court reporter to the Court of Chancery headed by Judge Collins Seats, who is now judge for the 3rd District U.S. Court of Appeals. Guilford supposedly is now a staff member with the Hubbard Communications Office, East Grinstead, England. Chris Rossi was supposedly given a medical discharge by the DuPont Company and is now living in Severna Park, Maryland. In September of 1965, Mr. Mertz left home because a suppressive person order was made against Mrs. Mertz. In November of 1965, Mr. Mertz went to Hubbard Communications Office, East Grinstead, England, for an 8-week training course in quote-unquote power processing. Mrs. Mertz feels that her husband had been brainwashed. Mrs. Mertz stated that in an effort to get her husband to return to the family, she contacted the founding church of Scientology and agreed not to interfere with her husband's beliefs. Following this, Mrs. Mertz agreed to participate in Scientology processing. She was audited by a Helen Whitney in Willingsboro, New Jersey, and through the first 3 release stage. The 4th release was done by Helen Whitney at Mertz Family Summer Home. According to Mrs. Mertz, the so-called processing involved holding the tin cans attached to the e-meter and responses to repeated questions asked by Helen Whitney. The so-called processing revealed the following. Release grade 0 disclosed that Mrs. Mertz had no problem communicating. Release grade 1, so-called problem release, disclosed that Mrs. Mertz had a problem, namely her husband and her interference with Scientology beliefs. Release grade 2, so-called relief grade, disclosed that Mrs. Mertz was relieved having recognized the problem. And release grade 3, so-called freedom release, Mrs. Mertz is supposedly taking steps to solve the problem and is becoming free of the problem. Release grade 4, so-called ability release, disclosed that Mrs. Mertz has the ability to handle the problem. Following the processing, Mrs. Mertz went to New York with Helen Whitney in September of 1967 for checkout auditing. She stated that she was to sit around, accomplished nothing, and missed her train home. She went to New York again on December 4th of 67 with her husband to appear in the Scientology chapel to thrash out the problem. After which she was given the checkout audit. Attached as exhibits are release certificate for grades 0 through 4, receipt for payment of release check, and release stages bulletin, all of which were presented to Mrs. Mertz on December 4th, 1967. According to Mrs. Mertz, her husband paid $650 for her processing and her checkout audit. During the processing by Helen Whitney, Mrs. Mertz stated that the place where she was audited and processed was stocked with vitamins, and that Helen Whitney presented that Mrs. Mertz take some of the vitamins prior to processing, stating that the vitamins would help make her feel better during the processing. Mrs. Mertz stated that she declined to take the vitamins. Mrs. Mertz stated that her husband has been taking numerous vitamins and health food preparations such as vitamin E, calcium, and wheat germ, and glucata. Mrs. Mertz showed me the packages of these products which her husband had left at home. Mrs. Mertz stated that she had ear operations in November of 1966 and June of 1967 for removal of calcium deposits. According to Mrs. Mertz, her husband commented, quote unquote, "I hope the doctors don't mess you up so that Scientology can't help." Mr. Mertz is supposed to go to St. Hill, East Grinstead, England in March of 1968 for internship training using the Fabulous Power process, in which he will be a solo auditor himself. He will supposedly pay $750 for the internship training. According to Mrs. Mertz, her husband expects to sell all property and have his wife accompany him to England. She thinks he expects to remain in England and devote his life to Scientology. Mrs. Mertz stated that her husband is considered a field auditor of Scientology, and he carries an e-meter with him at all times. The e-meter was supposedly brought back from the 1965-66 trip to England. According to Mrs. Mertz, her husband has been able to keep his job only because he has admittedly not tried to influence fellow workers. She stated that he is living in a one-room dump in Philadelphia, for which he pays $57 per month in rent. She does not know what sums of money he has given to Scientology. She admits that he has made her sign income tax returns before they are filled out to prevent her from knowing what he has contributed. Mr. Mertz supposedly joined Scientology to improve himself. Mrs. Mertz stated that she would be willing to act as an informant and would argue to testify in an attempt to reveal the activities of the Scientology organization. The following exhibits were copied from records made available to me by Mrs. Mertz, and basically lists several letters, just statements from different people. Let's see, there's nothing we haven't kind of seen already in, receipt payments, a letter from Mr. Mertz to his children in which he refers to the disconnect and suppressive person orders placed against Mrs. Mertz by Scientology. Mr. Mertz tells his children that he is a Scientologist and cannot communicate with his wife after who the suppressive person order was placed against her. There's also a letter supposedly sent to Scientology members by John Fudge, the assistant pastor of the founding Church of Scientology. John Fudge is another name that we see quite frequently in a lot of these documents. Again, it's another family, another marriage completely destroyed because one person fell for this scam. The other person said, hold up, wait a second. I don't know about all this. And Scientology says, well, if you just start coming and get processed, if you start coming and getting your auditing and you get right, your marriage is going to be great. But in the end, unfortunately, another marriage destroyed. So, what are your thoughts about this story? What are your thoughts about this interview, and the situation with this married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Mertz? I'd appreciate hearing what your thoughts are. And please remember, no more kids in Scientology. Kids can't consent. Please remember to spread love and kindness wherever you go. And I will catch you on the next one.